at, and I think it's important to note to the school board this evening and also for the community, is that they don't look at projected growth in the community. For example, we are currently in the process of development of Founders Row here in the City of Falls Church. We're not exactly sure what's going to happen at the corner of Washington and Broad. There's going to be some development there. We know that there's going to be a lot of development up next to the high school. Those numbers are not calculated into the projections by Weldon Cooper. So I say that only to put it on your radar and to perhaps even foreshadow for you what enrollment may look like as we continue moving forward, making our enrollment projections. This is an interesting slide that is new this year. But I think graphically it represents some trend. I think there's no way around it. It goes up. And what we see here is that Weldon Cooper has done a pretty nice job of projecting. And we did take a dip. This started in 2001. It goes out to 2020, 2021 projections. We did take a dip after 2017, 2018, but we are seeing, again, enrollment beginning to rise. And I only anticipate that that will go up from where we are now. So here's the projections by grade for next year. So as I orient you to this chart, what I would start with is that across the top are FY17 actual, 18 actual, 19 actual, and 20 actual. Those are the actual enrollments. And then we look at the fiscal year 21 projection and how that change looks. So you'll begin to see the delta on the far right-hand side, and then working down is by school. I think this chart is particularly useful, not necessarily for budget conversations, but for our school leadership to see where students are moving by grade. So I pointed out, for example, yesterday in one of our meetings that Mount Daniel, for example's projection for 2021 is 168 kindergartners. This year, our actual enrollment in kindergarten was 181. If the projection holds, we'll be 13 fewer in kindergarten. So where are those 13 going? Well, they're going one grade up. So if you look at this coming 21 projection, we're looking at 187 first graders compared to 172 the prior year, so looking at growing by 15. The interesting number that I think we've called attention to for a number of years now is that sixth grade class at Mary Ellen Henderson that moved up last year. This year, our actual enrollment was 236, and next year we're anticipating that that sixth grade class will be 171, which means that that class will lose 65 students, but our seventh grade group will grow by 41. And they're growing by 41 because their starting point was fewer than the previous year. The big nugget here for the board and for the community to recognize is that it looks as though we're going to grow by a total of 37 students across the division this year, if the projections hold. And it will be across all grade levels. So one of the things you won't see in this budget this year are any additional teaching positions in our schools. And we feel like we will be able to absorb those 37 students while maintaining the class sizes that we are committed to as a school division. These two pie charts are traditional. This is where is the money coming from and how are we spending the money. So what you'll see here is the 2021 proposed budget pie charts. On the left-hand side, you'll see that the local transfer from the general government and city council represents 81.7% of our pie, and the state aid this year will represent 14.7% of our pie, and it gets smaller from there. We have a small amount of money that comes from the federal government, 1.1% for federal programs. That number, by the way, is shrinking from last year, so we are seeing less dollars coming from the federal government, some fees, and then some beginning balance. But the right-hand side shows where we spend the money, and this is a common theme that you've heard me talk about for the last couple of years, and that is when you take the two largest areas of that pie together, the salary and the benefits, it's about 86% of the pie in the City of Falls Church schools is spent on salaries and benefits. Those are our people. So when we hear questions about can we tighten our belt or can we get lean, the only way that we can really fundamentally shift the game in terms of a budget is for us to cut people. It's very difficult to get into contracted services. We can take a little bit here and there from materials and supplies, but if we really want to make inroads in cutting a budget, the place we have to go is by cutting people, which means that we're taking staff out of our schools more than likely. So it's very difficult for us as a school system to really tighten our belts. What we can do is we can become more efficient and we can look at where there are opportunities, and we did that last year. So you may recall we cut 5 positions across the system last year. We got very lean, we got very efficient, and in the end, we're able to make some adjustments in our budget and be able to compensate our staff because of that. Again, this year, I don't see that we're going to need to make those same cuts that we did last year based on the transfer amount that we're receiving and some state aid. So the guidance on December 9th of last year was 3.1, which represents organic growth. The funding share of 3.1% to the city schools is $1.34 million. So that becomes our starting point for building our budget with the transfer from the general government. We anticipate, just like we have in the past, that through this methodology, if there are additional revenues that fall out at the end of the budget cycle or at the end of the year, that those revenues would be shared 50-50. And that is, in some ways, a handshake deal that we have made with the general government. So that means that the entire transfer to the city schools from the general government this coming year at 3.1% represents $44,596,706. The big story for us this year is state revenue. Based on the governor's proposed budget that was released on December 19th, state revenue in the City of Falls Church Schools will represent 14.7% of our budget. It's a greater percentage than it has been in the past, and here's the reason why. This year, like they do every 2 years, the state re-benchmarks. In other words, they go back, they look at the standards of quality, they look at the amount of money that is funded through the state government to pay for those things that are in the standards of quality, and they continue to fund those. The state has yet to fully fund the standards of quality, but they are working hard to make amends around that. This past re-benchmarking, the state also had an opportunity to make some changes to some ratios. And because they made some changes to some of the ratios that happen in the schools, so for example, school council ratios dropped, some other ratios dropped, the state then put more money into the standards of quality, and that meant that more money was going to come to school divisions. We already exceed what the new re-benchmarked ratios are for the positions that are part of the state's SOQ now, which means that the dollars that we're receiving become much more flexible because we're already meeting the revised benchmark that the state has given us. So what that means for us with respect to state aid is that state aid is going to come in this year at about $4.9 million. That's an increase of $712,000 through state aid, and sales tax is going to be $3.1 million roughly, and it's projected to increase at about $253,000 or about 17.1%. Again, this is the governor's budget that we're utilizing. We feel a little bit confident, a little bit more confident than we typically do because it is a Democratic governor, it's a Democratic House, it's a Democratic Senate, and there still is roughly $200 million for the legislature to look at and to be able to utilize. So feeling quite confident in many of these numbers. So when you take those in combination, that gives us about $940,000 additional money in the school system that we didn't have previously to work with within our budget. So our projected revenues, again, for 2021, as I indicated before, are a combination of our local revenue, state revenue, federal revenue, and then some beginning balance. And we don't anticipate changing our beginning balance. It will remain at about $450,000. And that is essentially like a rainy day fund that we keep just like we would in our homes, just in case something happens. But what's interesting under the federal revenue is you will see that there's a projected total of about $573,000 coming from the federal government. That is a decrease in an award for our federal grants program by about $12,000, which is disappointing. So it leads us now to what are our priorities as a division. After speaking with the board and talking a little bit about budget priorities, after speaking with principals, after speaking with staff, and multiple groups throughout the community, the number one thing that came up as a priority across the system has been and continues to be compensation for the system. So tonight, what I'm proposing as my budget is that we provide a step increase for all of our eligible employees across the system. This is the deal that we make with our staff to say, when you get into a step-in grade system, that every year we're going to advance your pay by a certain amount. This step increase for us this year represents about $971,000 and is on average about a 2.7% increase for every employee that would get a step. The other piece of the proposal around compensation is looking at a cost of living adjustment, and I'm proposing a 1% cost of living adjustment in addition to the step. So not only will people move to the next step that are eligible, but it also will help us grow and remain competitive within the salary scale. Because if we don't add money into the salary scale through a market scale adjustment, the scale stays the same and we begin to lose competitiveness in the marketplace. And that's really important to us. So these are needs, and so I think about needs, wants, and mandatory when we think about a budget. This is a need for us. So in terms of presenting a needs-based budget, we need to be competitive and we need to compensate our employees. The next slide represents a mandatory. This is a non-negotiable for us. And by the way, and I'm going to back up just for a second, because I do want to also do the quick math on this slide. That's about $1.37 million, which is about the amount of the transfer that we would get from the general government. So thinking about employee compensation, that roughly eats up the entire transfer from the locality. The mandatory requirements that we have are our health insurance rates are rising this year. We're anticipating a 10% rate increase for both the employer and the employee portion of that rate. We do participate with the general government. It's a nice efficiency that we have, and we're part of the same pool. And they are also calculating about a 10% increase as well. In addition to that, the Virginia retirement system cost is going up by about $270,000. The retirement rate is increasing from 16.68% up to 17.83%. And that is to take care of some concerns that the actuarials have with the VRS system. And lastly, the Virginia retirement system's life insurance policy expenditures are going to go up by a very small amount, but about $1,700 from 1.31% to 1.33%. So those are mandatory. So we have wants mandatory or needs mandatory, and here is another set that I would characterize as a need. And these become the 2021 investments on our goals and in our future. So the total amount of these requests that we've prepared for you tonight is $540,734. The thing, and I'm going to work sort of from the middle and then to the side. One of the things that I want to make sure that I call your attention to in the community and as the board is that we have aligned, again, all of our desired budgetary requests with those three big ideas that are in the placemat. So IB for all, closing gaps, caring community, closing gaps, caring community and culture, and caring community and culture. There are some that are for the secondary schools, there are some that are system-wide, and there's one that is for preschool only. So let me start and work down the list on the left-hand side. The first request that we have is for a second International Baccalaureate Middle Years Program Coordinator. We have one at the high school who manages the DP program. So we have a DP coordinator, that is Dan Coast. He's responsible for the diploma program, which is grades 11 and 12. And then we have Alicia Miller, who is our middle years program. And again, for the community, not for people here, but the middle years program spans grades 6 through grades 10. So that's 5 grade levels of responsibility that the middle years program coordinator has. What we're finding is that the depth and complexity necessary to do the work within the middle years program is beyond the scope of one person. And if we're truly going to be an International Baccalaureate school division that's premier, not only in the country but across the world, we need to provide the appropriate staff to be able to take care of the needs of the International Baccalaureate program. It's particularly critical, I think, this coming year because we have a reauthorization coming up for our IB program. So our teams of teachers are reevaluating their units of study, they're going back, they're reworking some of the assessments, they're working through some of the curriculum and the like. and that takes leadership. And so this position would be a leadership type position, but based in the schools, working with our teachers. The second is our English, and